Good afternoon. I'm David Lampton, Oxenberg Rolling Fellow at APARC, and I'm glad you all could join us this evening. I'm here to welcome all of you and introduce our speaker, who then will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A and end it at a quarter to the hour. So in any case, feel free to submit your questions via the chat function or the Q&A function, and I'll remind you at the end and take the privilege of the first question to get people queuing up. But we want this to be as lively and interactive as it can be given the circumstances. Tonight we have with us Dr. Thomas Fingar. We could hardly have anybody better qualified to talk about the topic this evening, and the topic is, was America's China policy a foolish failure? There's certainly a revisionist school of thought that's gaining momentum that the last 35, 40 years of U.S. China policy was misguided in one or more respects, and Tom's going to speak about that set of issues. As I said, he's extremely qualified. Many of you know him well, but for those of you that may be less familiar, let me just say he started his career at Stanford University, indeed doing many of the things that got our academic exchanges between China and the United States going. So he's been involved with engagement with China since its earliest days, and he's early in his career at Stanford University. After he left Stanford, he went to the Washington, D.C., to the Department of State, where he occupied a number of positions, but certainly notably as Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research. And then when the Directorate of National Intelligence was created, he went as the first Deputy Director of National Intelligence for the United States. Tom's now involved with our colleague Jean Oy in editing a book that will be coming out soon. I've just been informed it's just been printed, so it should be in bookstores near you, or I guess in this day, you'll have to get it on Amazon. In any case, it's called Fateful Decisions, Choices That Will Shape China's Future, and it's coming out from Stanford University Press. Tom, we look forward to your remarks, and I'm sure we'll have an active Q&A period afterwards. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. Thanks to everybody who is tuning in for this talk. That before actually beginning the talk, let me provide a little bit more detail about my background on this subject. That this is in part an academic talk about the topic of U.S. engagement with China. But the current narrative that Mike alluded to is one that I take personally because of the involvement that I had, and Mike Lampton, who introduced me, also has decades of direct involvement in the relationship. Much of mine, 23 years, was in Washington. That the current narrative disparages not just the policy, but the people over 8 administrations, liberal and conservative, Republican and Democrat, including some of our colleagues here at Stanford, George Shultz and Bill Perry and Condi Rice, and other normally regarded as tough-minded internationalists, such as Cap Weinberger, Dick Cheney, participated as Secretary of Defense. I could make a long list of people, Big Brzezinski, that I list them because I want to spend most of the talk challenging the current narrative about U.S. policy towards China, a policy now generally referred to as engagement. I'm not going to address it point by point, but I'm going to focus on the logic and the achievements of this policy. My talk is based on a chapter that I wrote for a book compiled in honor of Mike Lampton by our friend Ann Thurston, looking at 50 years of U.S. China relations. So a little bit later than the book that I've done with Gene, that will be out for all who are interested. But let me switch to a few words about the current narrative so that you'll understand what I have in mind by that title. The argument is that engagement failed to democratize China, that it created a dangerous rival in the form of the People's Republic of China, and that the policy was bad for the United States and for the American people. It was misguided, it was naive, and it was counterproductive. And most of all, it failed to transform China. There are a number of things that are wrong about that characterization, which I hope will become clear as I speak. But one of the somewhat ironic aspects of it is that the imputation of intention to transform China, to democratize China, which was never a part of the U.S. policy or policy logic, but is very much a part of a recurring Chinese characterization of American objectives. So in many ways, revisionist critics of the policy have adopted a position that the Communist Party of China has articulated episodically over the last 40 years. The revisionist narrative misconstrues the rationale and goals of American policy. It's not simply a matter of academics are smarter than bureaucrats, journalists are wiser than the policy people that they write about. But it's instrumental, at least in part. It's a rationalization to justify calls that for a different policy towards China. Indeed, a different policy of the United States to engagement with much of the world. That we need a different policy. Why do we need a different policy? Because the previous policy has failed. This disparagement of 8 presidents and their administrations, who regardless of their backgrounds, the positions on China that they had articulated during the campaigns, rather quickly came to embrace and foster the evolution of what has become known as the engagement policy. The revisionist critique gains traction in part and is a problem in large part because as Americans, we have no memory. But it's also generational. You know, most people in the United States have been born well into the period of this policy. So its origins are veiled in the mists of time. It's easy to forget, therefore to not understand and to misconstrue the characterization. One of the intriguing to me aspects of the critique is it really doesn't address the question of why did successive administrations in different times with different policy objectives, different parties, all embrace the same policy? Why is there a remarkable policy continuity over 50 years? The other intriguing defect of the current narrative is it doesn't offer an alternative for dealing with the past. There's no suggestion of an alternative to engagement that would have produced either the imputed objectives or some other objectives. So we've got this was bad because it failed, without having a baseline of what it was intended to accomplish. Let me jump to the bottom line so you know where I'm going in the narrative, my own narrative here. One point is that engagement helped to make China more prosperous, more capable, stronger, but also a better place. Going in and out of China since the 1970s, it is unquestionably a better, more prosperous place. Chinese people are better off than they were. It also made the United States more secure. It made Asia more stable, and it made America more prosperous. I'll elaborate on that point. And finally, engagement made disengagement, or decoupling in the current parlance, both undesirable and probably impossible. We have a web of relationships from which both sides benefit that, though beset with problems, cannot easily and certainly not wisely be dismantled. But let me turn to the genesis of what I'll call re-engagement or rapprochement, which would be the first decade, the decade after Richard Nixon and Mao altered the relationship that had existed since 1949. It's important to remember that engagement, like the policy it replaced, the policy of containment, is deeply rooted in the Cold War context. Containment of China began when Mao concluded an alliance with Stalin. Cold War had begun, knowingly made China the enemy of the United States. It subjected China to the containment policies aimed at the Soviet Union. 4 months later, North Korea invaded the South. 4 months after that, Chinese troops entered into the Korean War. This is one of the hot fronts in the Cold War. Position of the two countries was one of hostility. Very, very little contact from 1949 until the late 1960s. What changed in the late 1960s was that Richard Nixon, even before he was elected the first time, saw an opportunity in the visibly worsening relationship, worsening of an already bad relationship between China and the Soviet Union, to calculate Moscow's strategic calculus. Mao saw an opportunity to enhance China's security when the country was deeply enmeshed in Mao's catastrophic cultural revolution. So there was a convergence in time of interests in enhancing security, reducing the threat posed to each country by the Soviet Union. One can debate in retrospect whether the threat was exaggerated, whether it was greater to one side or the other, but the fact of the matter is both sides saw this as a very significant threat that needed to be addressed. And rapprochement begins clearly from the United States side as a policy designed to enhance U.S. security, security primarily in military terms, to enhance the deterrent value of the United States alliance by adding China to the mix. Re-engagement, or rapprochement, or this stage of engagement, had a very limited goal. It was to take advantage of the enemy of my enemy is my friend possibilities. Neither side anticipated or sought to engineer political change or a close political alignment. Didn't seek or expect economic interaction. This was all about security. And certainly from the US perspective, that was objective number one. Number two, all the way to number N, was to enhance security. Neither side anticipated or worked for a deeper relationship. That China during the Cultural Revolution under Mao was not interested. Both sides had achieved what they wanted with the Shanghai Communique, adding uncertainty to the calculus of the Soviet Union about whether China would come to the assistance of the United States or the United States would come to China's assistance in the event of actions against one or the other, or in a US case, allies. That I once asked one of my more senior colleagues in the State Department about what did we expect from China? What did we need to make this new relationship work? And his flippant answer was in some ways telling. He said, we don't expect much. We don't expect China to change. We certainly don't think China is going to change us. All it has to do is not move. As long as China remains next to the Soviet Union and Moscow calculates that we Beijing and Washington have a relationship that they don't want to test, we've gotten out of this our number one objective. This 1971-72 rapprochement launched a period and a process that's become known as normalization. As it was described at the time, normalization would be a rebuilding of relationships to make it a normal one between states. That was to be manifest in the establishment of formal diplomatic relations. That's still a pretty limited objective. We already had, for example, formal diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Again, the expectations were pretty limited and nearly all confined to the security arena. But the United States in the Nixon administration and the Ford administration that followed was interested in completing the process of normalization as a prerequisite, as a necessary step before moving possibly onto a different kind of relationship. But moving beyond the enemy of my enemy stage of the relationship was delayed by Watergate and the impeachment of Richard Nixon, by Mao's undying suspicion of the United States, fear of the United States, by Mao's death and the period of consolidation of a new leadership after September 1976, and by US domestic politics. For example, the Ford administration, President Ford was interested in moving forward towards full diplomatic relations. The game plan that the United States was using, in part, was a book published in 1971 by Dick Morstein and Mort Abramowitz called Remaking China Policy. It set out kind of things that needed to be done along the way. One of those things was to create a team outside of government to work on, identify problems, work on strategies to achieve a normal relationship. For reasons that I have never fully understood, I was asked to head that outside the government team in late 1975. We were to move ahead towards normalization until candidate Ronald Reagan challenged candidate Gerald Ford in a presidential primary debate in 1976, challenged him by asserting that his administration planned to switch recognition from Taipei to Beijing. Ford denied that there was anything underway, so it came to a halt. I personally do not believe the time was right. Situation and possibilities changed. After Mao died, after the new leadership had consolidated not just the leadership team, but a strategy of moving forward to correct the deficiencies, restore economic capability, restore education, and so forth. Policy that became known as reform and opening. The key here is that by late 1977, it had become clear to observers outside of China, including in the United States government, that Beijing seemed prepared to abandon the quest for Stalinist economic autarky and Maoist revolutionary change by adopting a strategy of export-led growth that eventually became known as the Japan path to modernization. If China was serious about following a path of export-led growth, again, it opened new possibilities for the United States. And the Carter administration was quick to try and explore those possibilities. The opportunities that appeared inherent in this strategy were broader than security, though security remained a critical element of it. But when I teach U.S. foreign policy towards Northeast Asian region, I use a mnemonic to characterize U.S. Overarching objectives that go all the way back to the 18th century. And the mnemonic is the United States wanted security, sales, and souls. Security is self-evident. Protect American interests and the interests of American partners and allies. Sales is commerce. It's access to the China market. It's an opening for American firms to do business in China. Souls, back in the 19th century, this was religious to the core, the conversion of Chinese to Christianity, but it broadened to be people to people, better health, better education, civil society, human rights. So those three buckets of objectives, two of which were completely impossible during the enemy of my enemy is my stage of the relationship, became possible, or they appeared to be possible in the late 1970s. Again, the context is still the Cold War. In 1970, the Soviet Union appeared ascendant, appeared more threatening than it had been a decade earlier when rapprochement began. Activism, engagement in Africa, in Afghanistan. The invasion didn't come until the end of 1979, but the manipulation of domestic politics in Afghanistan had begun before that. So the Soviet threat was real, or perceived to be real and serious. Finding a way to counter that, sustaining the benefits of rapprochement with the new leadership in China. Chinese policy was so closely associated with Mao Zedong for 3 decades. And Mao was a quirky, idiosyncratic actor much of the time. So there was a question as whether or not the new leadership in China, after all, this was the different communist leadership that subscribed to the same ideology as the Soviet Union, would there be rapprochement between Beijing and Moscow? So it wasn't a sure thing that the benefits achieved by Nixon and Mao would be sustained. The U.S. had economic incentives by the late 70s. We were deeply mired in what became known as stagflation. We had a stagnant economy, it wasn't growing, and we had very high levels of inflation. The lure of the China market that had been there since the decade after the American Revolution was rekindled. So there became we added an economic motive to the policy objectives here of what became known as engagement. China's new strategy, this export-led growth that required access to markets, capital, training, in the most highly developed countries, was impossible without the acquiescence and active support of the United States. That all of those highly developed countries that China needed to follow this path of development were allies of the United States. The door to those countries was located in Washington. So China had real incentives to improve relations with the United States. But the United States needed stuff from China as well. That we didn't need China as much, but it was seen as advantageous to open up new possibilities in China that would help the United States to grow out of its stagflation economic problems, as well as creating opportunities for American firms and other entities. The primary rationale for engagement, for assisting China's drive for export-led growth, supporting its policy of the four modernizations, agriculture, industry, science and technology, and the military, was it offered an opportunity to make China a stronger partner in the seemingly never-ending Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. The logic was, again, pretty simple. If China is going to be our partner in this long-term competition with a hostile existential threat to the United States and its allies, it was better to have a strong partner than a weak partner. That if we were going to enter into kind of a three-legged race tied to China, it was better for the Chinese partner to be capable of carrying more of the weight, more of the load, not be a burden. A related objective was to lock in the reform and opening policy in China. Anybody who had looked back, lived through the first 30 years of the People's Republic, knew that policies, major national policies, had a half-life measured in single-digit years. That rebuilding after the Civil War and Japanese occupation lasted about 3 years. Central planning, Stalinists, lasted about 4 years before the Great Leap Forward, which lasted 4 years, produced disastrous results, and produced 4 years of retrenchment and recovery before the launch of the Cultural Revolution, which lasted a decade. So American objective was to lock in policies that offered far better opportunities, prospects for the United States than what had come before, and to lock it in by helping to produce concrete benefits as quickly as possible. To do this, Washington turned to its Cold War playbook. That the policy of engagement with China drew upon very heavily lessons that had been learned in the first decades of the Cold War. A key part of that was that the U.S. would use its military and economic strength to extend benefits to its partners. Initially, this was our free world, in quotes, allies that did not assume reciprocity. It was inherently asymmetric. U.S. would provide more security than it received. It would provide greater opportunity than it demanded of its partners. Again, this was designed to preserve stability, peace, enhance our own security, and to make our partners stronger. If the partner became stronger, the alliance, or in the case of China, the quasi-partnership, became stronger. As that became stronger, the U.S. became more secure. The international system became more stable. As the partners became more adept technologically, more developed economically, more prosperous as societies, it created more opportunities. It made the United States more prosperous. So we got security benefits out of it, and we got economic benefits out of it. China was unique. China was the only country that came into this organization, association, collection of like-minded countries that was not required to change its political system, was not required to become a democracy, was not required to become a formal ally, was not required to change. But the reason for it was the opening up of the economy and the society, and that as an instrument to enhancing security. The Chinese asserted at the time, and I believe they genuinely feared, that the United States objectives included regime change through what the Chinese referred to as peaceful transformation. They regularly referred to a former Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, quote in a Life magazine article. They're going to seek peaceful transformation of the communist world. So they were skeptical or suspicious, cautious, hedged against American intentions for change from the beginning. But again, from 1975 forward, having been a part of that process, initially as a very junior person on the margins and later in more senior positions, achieving democratic change was not an objective. We had a different understanding than the Chinese did about what engagement would lead to, what participation in this export-led strategy of development would lead to. The Chinese, in my view, not their words, envisioned sort of a temporary participation. They were going to exploit opportunities offered by export-led growth to jumpstart China's indigenous development, self-strengthening. Again, for mnemonic, they wanted to get in, get rich, and get out. And in the process, avoid being enmeshed in dependencies, vulnerabilities, rules and norms that they had had no role in shaping. This was to be temporary, this was to be hedged. The Americans understood that that was China's aspiration and essentially said, good luck, you're welcome to try. But if you're going to pursue modernization, development, economic strength, national strength, influence in the international system through this rules-based international order, the liberal order, the more you benefit, the more deeply enmeshed you are in the system. And the more your continued growth and expanding influence depend on continued participation in the system. You're going to acquire a stake that makes the cost of exit very high, but you're welcome to try. There was no need to fight about this at the time. The short-term objective was both of us was to produce results quickly, to demonstrate the benefits of this new developmental strategy for China, and for the United States to lock in the strategy on the Chinese side. U.S. expectations were consistent with modernization theory, with democratic theory. Economic prosperity creates a middle class that has interests in the system, that becomes politically active and requires a more accountable political system. It's also fully consistent with Marxist theory, that the nature of the economy determines the political superstructure. But officials in Washington basically pay no attention to academic theories. But the policy rested much more firmly on experiences from the use of this Cold War playbook in Europe and in Asia. That the relevant models were Japan, Taiwan, and the Republic of Korea. The way in which they utilized this strategy to modernize, the way modernization enmeshed them in the rules-based order, gave them a stake, made them contributors to that order, locked in the democratic changes imposed during occupation on Japan, and led to political transformation and societal transformation in Taiwan and the Republic of Korea. Now let me turn to some of the modalities and the consequences of engagement. The policy, U.S. policy, was intended to open doors, to facilitate ties among engagement by subnational actors, states, cities, firms, schools, non-governmental organizations, professional associations. It's fully consistent with sort of American federalism, constitutional limits, that the federal government of the United States doesn't run very many things. It's in charge of foreign policy, it's in charge of security policy, but for example, education ties and training. There are no federal universities in the United States except the military academies. There are no state-owned enterprises in the United States. The agents of engagement in the U.S. policy and in the reality are largely subnational, largely private sector. And a primary goal of engagement was to open the door, to make it possible for multiple actors at many levels of the system to engage with counterparts in China. One of the explicit goals, as discussed among the policymakers responsible for formulating and implementing these policies, I ascribe it to Mike Oxenberg, who was a Stanford professor on Jimmy Carter's National Security Council staff. And that was a goal of forging a broad web of relationships, state to province, sister city, city to city, bureaucratic organization to bureaucratic organization, military to military, academic institutions to academic institutions, NGOs to counterparts in China, and so forth. The idea of this is that it would add stability to the relationship, that the more ties, the more relationships existed, the easier it would be to withstand inevitable times of tension and dispute in the relationship, to avoid single point of failure, government to government level if an issue came up, to buttress that with a broad array of relationships. The expectation was it was highly unlikely that all of the multitude of relationships would be bad at the same time. You could fall back on, you would have constituencies that would advocate for continuing the relationship, even in times of tension and dispute. By the late 1980s, sort of a decade into this form of engagement, there were indeed very extensive business ties, academic ties, NGO, religious ties, and others that were able to sustain the relationship despite the jarring events in Tiananmen Square and the imperative that the United States respond and the inevitability that Beijing respond to American-imposed sanctions and backing away. Both sides backed away from the relationship. But it never appeared in serious danger of rupture because of the multiplicity of relationships that existed, that recognized the need for, or were at the vanguard of calling for a pullback, but a temporary pullback. To wait until a situation improved and then move forward, again in the relationship. I'll come back to the multiple ties in a minute. But there's another buttressing pillar of the engagement policy, another reason that the policy remained as stable as it did over the decades. And that is that a succession of U.S. administrations had higher priorities, bigger problems than the relationship with China. As a China specialist, you know, those of my tribe think that this is, of course, the most important country and the most important relationship. And if it's important enough for me to study, it must be the most important one in the U.S. government. But the fact of the matter is it's not, or it wasn't, during most of the last 4 decades. That after Tiananmen, the Bush 41 administration, Bush was preoccupied with ending the Cold War, ending this rivalry without violence and building a new world order, as he could it, and other things like the Iraq attack on Kuwait, first Gulf War, Japan's economic challenge, and that's implications for the United States. The Clinton administration was concerned with the war in the Balkans, ethnic cleansing in the Balkans and in Africa, with North Korea's nuclear program, the Middle East generally, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Arab-Israeli. Bush 43 was terrorism, 9/11 at the early in the first term, Afghanistan, Iraq, North Korea. For Obama, it was the financial crisis, trying to get out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Again, North Korea. That there are only so many difficult, consequential problems that any leadership can take on at the same time. Were there problems in U.S. China relationships across this period? Yes, there were. Centered on human rights at the beginning of the period I just skimmed over. Economic in the middle and building towards the end, and others. But with other issues, more pressing issues on the plate of senior-most leaders, nobody wanted to make China a problem. Nobody had an appetite for changing U.S. policy towards China, continuing policies that are basically producing the security, economic, and people-to-people objectives they were designed to produce, can pretty much run themselves. That mid-level, lower-level bureaucrats can handle the policy, that the companies, the NGOs, the state governments involved can manage the relationship on a day-to-day basis. And to deal with some of the higher priority problems, it was useful for Washington to be able to work them with Chinese support or Chinese cooperation. At a minimum, the absence of Chinese opposition to what the U.S. was trying to do. Policy continuity, in my experience in Washington, is the default position, unless for some reason a president feels compelled or enters office determined to fix some problem or re-engineer some aspect of the international system or the trading relate, whatever it happens to be. So the continuity in U.S.-China relations is in part a function of it was producing its objectives. It was enhancing American security. It was adding to American prosperity. It was facilitating interaction between Chinese and American organizations and individuals that were mutually beneficial, not equally beneficial, but mutually beneficial, and created constituencies that wanted to maintain those policies. This multiplicity of groups with a stake in the China relationship play politics in America as the system is designed to facilitate. But not all of the constituencies were equal. The most important one was the business community. The ones who had direct benefit of the sales portion of the policy, that build commercial relationships. This is a constituency that speaks with considerable weight in Washington. As one, again, a kind of a quasi-facetious comment made to me in DC by a lobbyist in championing continuity of U.S.-China policy. Don't forget who pays for politics in America. It's the business community and the wealthy people who benefit from the business community. And it's after a succession of presidential elections, in almost all of them, China was an issue. Criticism of China, some aspect of U.S.-China relations, it was an issue. And metaphorically, the day after the election, no matter who won, this powerful business constituency said, campaign rhetoric was one thing, glad it got you elected. Now get real. This is about money. This is about very difficult to assemble production chains, delivery mechanisms, joint ventures, joint research. Very quickly, every administration adopted a slightly varied version of engagement because it was producing the security objectives for the United States, the people-to-people objectives of the United States, and the economic objectives. The issues in U.S.-China relations, and I mean issues, problems, things we disagreed on, things that we fought over, were repeatedly deferred. Deal with them in the future. One reason they were deferred was because the constituencies who were engaged in them, who experienced these problems, and increasingly brought them to the attention of political actors in Washington, usually concluded their litany of complaints with a stay out of it, government. Don't politicize. These are economic issues. These are business issues. These are academic kind of issues. Don't politicize it. That will make it harder to resolve. We don't want that complication. And while that went on, a number of issues festered and got worse. Very few of them sort of solved themselves. So by the latter part of Obama's second term, there were a number of issues that could no longer be ignored. They had to be engaged. Any president would have had to act. There are many ways that a president could have acted different from the way in which Donald Trump did, but the issues were there. Does that mean engagement failed? My answer to that question is certainly not. The current narrative says it failed because it didn't transform China into a democracy. But again, democracy promotion was not a goal of U.S. engagement policy. It probably, or in some cases, almost certainly was an objective of some of the constituencies and some of the individuals who took advantage of the opportunity created by engagement. The academics that hoped to transform China, the religious organizations, the medical organizations, and the like that may have hoped to transform. But that wasn't a U.S. government policy. We created the possibility, and institutions or private sectors or subnational governments carried it out. Not even during George W. Bush 43's second term with the democracy agenda was democratizing China an objective. So 50 years of engagement should be evaluated against the goals that it actually pursued. Enhancing U.S. security and the security of our allies and partners. That was the primary goal. There have been no major wars in Asia since normalization. The entire period of engagement has seen no war in Asia. It's the longest period of peace in the region in modern history. That allowed the region to become the most dynamic, fastest growing, increasingly prosperous, it contributed to the lifting of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. One of the people-to-people goals that I've grouped under souls, that it made the region more prosperous. China's actions, as distinct from China's rise, have revitalized alliances. So too did U.S. policy during the engagement period. So a portion of that policy normally referred to as hedging. Hope for the best, prepare for things that don't conform to the best. And U.S. alliances were strengthened with Japan, with Korea, particularly with NATO for other reasons. China has become wealthier, its military capability is much stronger, but it'll be a very long time before China catches up to U.S. military capability, and an even longer time before it matches the capability of the U.S. and its allies. The goal of maintaining U.S. economic strength and increasing U.S. prosperity. It's true that China became more prosperous, more modern, more influential, but was that to the detriment of the United States? Again, the answer is no. Some facts, I think, make the argument clear. China is normally assessed to be a major, even a superpower, because of the size of its economy and its rapid rate of growth over decades. That China's share of the global economy increased from slightly less than 2% to 15.8% over the 1978 to 2018 period. That's pretty impressive growth. What happened to the United States? Many people talk as if it's a seesaw. If China's going up, the United States must be going down. That's simply the way it works. But the US share of the global economy in 1978 was just under 27%. 42 years later, China's rise, Japan's impressive growth in the 80s before the bubble economy broke, the end of the Cold War, the expansion of the European Union, the spread of export-led growth strategies to dozens of more countries. US share of the global economy has decreased. We're all the way down to 24%, 23.9%. That's not much slippage over that period of time. And if you control for population, we actually went up because US share of world population went from 5.2 to 4.3. Again, comparative here, sometimes useful. China's share of world population went from 22 to 18% of the world total. So at 18% of the world's people, it produces not quite 16% of economic product. It's still punching below its weight, which if everybody kind of produced equally, you'd expect about the share of world population. Did Americans lose? Was this disadvantageous to the United States? Well, it's hard to figure out when you look at the number. US GDP grew from $2.4 trillion in 78 to 20.5 trillion in 2018. China grew from 178 billion to 13.6 trillion. So percentage-wise, it grew more from a very low base. But what about per capita? What was the impact on Americans? US per capita GDP over this period of engagement increased from $10,565 to $62,794. China's increased from $156 to $9,770 something. China's average per capita and growth of per capita lags the world average. Chinese are much better off than they were. They're still a long way from being better off. And the jump from $10,000 to $62,000 per capita in the United States is not an indicator of we have been bested economically. You know, we have a distribution problem in the United States. The United States has become much wealthier. Americans have not. Average Americans have not. But that's not China's problem, and it's not the fault of engagement. By almost any measure, China has evolved in ways favored by and favorable to US interests. It's a better place. Its people are better off. It participates more fully, more constructively in the international system. It, by and large, does play by the rules. The trend over time is clear as China has joined more international control regimes, multilateral groupings to manage transnational problems, not just as a grumpy, the Americans made me do it participant, but now as a country that increasingly sees it in its own interest to work to check the spread of nuclear weapons, to combat climate change, to deal with energy and water problems and the like. Is China the kind of country we'd like it to be? Not yet. But prosperity is better for Chinese, but it's also better for the United States and for others. The prosperity of the region, the stability of the region is due in part to the relationships among China and its neighbors facilitated by the engagement policy of the United States. To repeat a point I made earlier, engagement has always been hedged. It's always put US interest first, principally security interest, secondarily economic interest. But it has always had the capacity and expectations about the influence of people-to-people ties, firm-to-firm ties. That US, contact with US has been described as highly corrosive to authoritarian regimes. Americans being Americans, doing things the way we do them, inherently challenges authoritarian regimes. It's one of the reasons that China fears a strategy of peaceful transformation, that it seeks to keep out bourgeois ideas, Western influence, Western media, and the like. That the alliance structure, the portfolio approach of companies that has been a part of, again, the way the American federal system works. It's not the genius of the policy, it's the policy allowing the strengths of the United States to play themselves out in the U.S. China relationship. Things have changed. That they've changed because of deterioration of the relationship that began before President Trump and his approach to foreign policy, economic policy. It's been disruptive, but there's no going back. Engagement will not be the same in going into the future. But engagement 2.0, some variant of it, updated for current conditions, is likely to be far more effective and is indeed far more likely to come about than deliberate decoupling or attempts to impose a containment policy on China. There are too many constituencies with a stake in the relationship to allow that. Our political system is such that those constituencies must be heard. And the alternative is discredited, and this will be my last point. I said that the revisionists offer no alternative that should have been followed during the last 40 years that would have achieved a different result or other presumably more desirable goals than the ones that I summarized. But the example of containment doesn't shine very brightly. We've had containment since 1950 with North Korea. We've had containment for 50 years, more than 50 years, with Cuba. It doesn't appear to have democratized either of those countries. It doesn't appear to have made them more prosperous. It doesn't appear to have contributed to American stability and security and prosperity. We have an example that doesn't work. Why would we want to adopt it to replace a policy that has worked exceedingly well? Thank you. Back over to Mike.
Thank you very much, Tom. We've got so many questions here. I'm going to forego my almost unstoppable tendency to ask the first question and go directly to the audience. If there's time at the end, I'll ask a question. The first question is, officials in Washington, speaking off the record, have suggested that the coronavirus may have escaped from a lab in Wuhan. Yet today, the NSC's O'Brien said, quote, "We don't know where the virus came from. That burden is on the Chinese." Based on your experience, Tom, if the intelligence community had compelling evidence of a lab accident or a deliberate cover-up of COVID-19, would we be hearing about it from an official on the record source?
Probably. That I find it gratifying that O'Brien has cast it as it's indeterminate. We don't know where it came from. That's a whole lot better than the scapegoating and finger pointing game that both sides have played about the source of the virus. That it's possible, we don't know. We have accidents in our country in secure containment facilities and the like. It's possible what happened in China. The problem is lack of transparency. And China has not been as transparent, as open as I believe it should be for its own interests, for tracking this disease, for learning lessons worldwide that will help in managing this one and preventing the next pandemic. if the intelligence community discovered proof of the origin, I believe it should stay as a data point to be worked by political leaders, not a bill of particulars as a part of a polemic about China. That the objectives ought to be to understand this pandemic and to manage the U.S. China relationship, not to find fault and fix blame, not to undercut particular officials. So in a more normal period of the United States government, intelligence discoveries, which are always tentative, that's why you go to intelligence. When you know you don't have enough information, when you've got contradictory information and you know it matters a lot and you don't have much time, to feed that in for policymakers to decide what to do about it. In the very leaky and partisan and contentious atmosphere that exists in Washington now, it almost certainly would leak out, which means it's almost certain somebody would want to get their spin on it before it leaked. I wish I had more confidence that it would be handled in the way back in the day.
Yeah, well, thank you. Next question is, do you think that the increasingly likely decoupling was accelerated by Presidents Trump and Xi? What do you foresee if Trump is reelected? Can the policy of engagement be resurrected? Chinese officials have always asserted that U.S. export controls make no sense and are Cold War remnants. Is this just propaganda? Does Beijing seriously lack understanding of Washington's intent? So I think the core of the question is, what do you expect, were we to replace our president, in terms of possibility of at least restoring more order to this relationship?
Yeah, that is the way I'd like to reframe it. Would a different president adopt different policies toward China, and would those different policies be more decoupling and containment, or what I'll call engagement 2.0, updated? Let me go into this by commenting on decoupling. Decoupling is an aspiration of some of the United States who want a different policy. It's a fact on the Chinese side that for the last decade, China has been tightening controls on its own citizens, on its firms. It has imposed restrictions. It has expelled journalists. It has banned use of Western textbooks as primary materials in coursework and the like. That if there's a decoupling, in fact, it's on the Chinese side, as opposed to accusations or aspirations on the U.S. side. That I think the Chinese, depends on who we mean by the Chinese. The information controls in China do limit the knowledge and therefore understanding and insight of many Chinese people about specific subjects like export controls. China has export controls. There are a great many things that won't sell in the United States. It doesn't call them a remnant of the Cold War. It does not allow U.S. firms to participate in broad sectors of the economy. It doesn't call that some kind of a containment and remnant. That, as I mentioned in my talk, the Cold War playbook of the U.S. being more open to others than we demanded they be open to us worked well with China, was applied to China, but it's now puzzling to the American public. Why are we still doing this 30 years after the Cold War? So there are pressures for greater reciprocity. We'll treat you the way you treat us. China loses if that becomes the standard for the relationship, because again, we're far more open than they are in all respects.
Next question from Don Emerson is, accepting the thrust of your argument, was there anything that should have been done differently by the American engagers during the period in question? If not, why not? And if so, what should have been done and why?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will construe it and bound it with reference to a dilemma in the policy. Because going back to the very different aspirations, expectations, China wanted to get in, get out after a short-term benefit to jumpstart, and we wanted to enmesh China in a broad sense of a rules-based international system and build this multiplicity of ties that they sought to avoid, sometimes more strenuously than others. The dilemma in this, and it's a common one in foreign policy, is that the policy can be more effective if you don't hold it in the face of the interlocutor country, the partner country. Don't throw it up to Chinese leaders that we're going to ensnare you in international dependencies. We're going to build your stake in the international system. We're going to make the cost of exit too high, because you'll discover that you'll benefit from it. By not explaining exactly what we were trying to do, a security, economic, people-to-people, and so forth, we build no broad constituency in the American public. It remains sort of the esoteric preserve, the pointy-headed, striped pants bureaucrats who are isolated inside the Beltway and don't understand the needs and aspirations of the American people. To have sold the policy publicly in the United States, to sold it more emphatically in the Congress, would have, in my judgment, undermined the ability to execute, implement that policy in China. I prefer the efficacy of the policy to the lack of broad public understanding for what it was about. That inherently made the policy more fragile than it might have been. And now that's a problem.
The next one's a long question, but I'll try and hopefully not do violence by shrinking the question. The basic question is that, well, don't some people actually criticize engagement because it allowed American economic and business interests to be so dominant? So that's part one of the question. The second part is that didn't policy change a little over time? Yes, security was really dominant in the early rationale. But later, and starting with George W. Bush, perhaps, maybe earlier, the idea of making China a responsible stakeholder in a more rounded sense became the objective. And that, the record is mixed. That certainly the questioner would say the record on that's pretty mixed. Mm-hmm. So on balance, do you agree that maybe, and this relates to the last question as well, we made a mistake in having U.S. economic interests be so dominant? And would you think we've been less successful the broader we defined our success, the whole stakeholder idea?
I understand and appreciate the question. Did we make economic considerations too dominant? There's a little bit of a hold back the tide aspect to that. We are a capitalist country. We have a vibrant private sector. U.S. power rests on our economic and technological capabilities. So it's sometimes juxtaposed with security. And recently it is our technological edge in the military domain is what allows us to be as preeminent as we are, to have the security that we have. And the economic interaction with China is undermining our technological edge and therefore our security. Sometimes and more often, in my experience, it's economics being given too much emphasis and not enough to human rights, not enough to the people-to-people dimension of it. Again, I understand the argument that values ought to be more important than money, kind of an argument. But the logic of the policy, which I fully support, was you've got a better chance of accelerating societal and instrumental change in a direction consistent with American values and aspirations through modernization. That modernization is a holistic process. You can't have a modern science establishment, a modern economy, a modern military, and have a backward society and political system. That it's not clear to me that you can change the social structure, change the way in which governments treat their own people, and that leading to economic change. Mao tried to do that. I mean, he had a goofy notion of what society ought to be, but it was going to be bottom-up change to create the new socialist man who'd build a better economy. So I think both the logic of allowing pretty much full play to the economic pillar of the relationship, which adds stability to the policy and enhances security as long as it's hedged, is a better way to do it than the alternative. And very few times that, yes, engagement has evolved over time as circumstances had changed, but really it's not until the turn of the 20th century that security, with its focus on the Soviet Union / Russia, began. It took a decade after the demise of the Soviet Union before everybody became convinced that Dracula wasn't going to stand up and pull the stake out of his heart. That the possibility of a resurgent red-brown coalition in Russia hung on for quite a while. And the security dimension of the relationship with China remained very important for a long time.
Well, thank you. And just one quick question, because you had sent me an article that I had not seen by Orville Schell on engagement and his assessment in light of things. And I just wanted to read a quote that jumped out at me from that, get your quick reaction, and we're actually 1 minute over time. So, but Schell in his recent foreign policy piece said, with divergence between the United States and China currently happening, replacing convergence, with divergence now replacing convergence in our relationship, engagement makes no sense. In other words, because we're in a high level of, let us say, friction with China, does engagement, is that a meaningless, counterproductive, or futile idea?
Not to me. That I actually do believe interaction with us is corrosive to authoritarian systems. That it's not that we are perfect, it's not that we live up to our values all the time, but our norms and our values are, many of them, enshrined in law, and we act in ways that I think are worthy of emulation. That I think 40 years of engagement, building on the long period of interaction before the 1949 break because of Cold War, that we have an impact. If we're not there, we have no impact. That thinking that Chinese will aspire to a more open society, more accountable system of governments, freer expression, modes of expression, social media, and the like, if they don't have contact with us And us, I mean the West, North America, Europe, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and other countries, that we are denying ourselves the use of one of our most potent instruments for managing relationships and managing change in a world.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all the people listening as well. But thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I hope everybody has a good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thanks for your time.